The last payment she ever made with the money that was truly hers came out to $4.63. It was for a carton of milk and a small bag of rice at the corner store, 2 blocks from the women's shelter where she and her daughter had been sleeping on donated cots for 11 nights. The cashier, a teenage boy with tired eyes and a phone he kept glancing at between customers, slid the change across the counter without looking at her. She counted the coins into her palm. She did not count them because she was confused. She counted them because she had learned, in the way that poverty teaches things, quietly and without mercy, that every cent had to be accounted for. If you stopped counting, you stopped surviving. Her name was Miriam. She was 44 years old. She had not always been the kind of woman who counted pennies in a convenience store under fluorescent lights, while her daughter waited outside on a bench with everything they still owned, zipped into 2 canvas bags. There had been a house once, a modest one, with a small yard and a lemon tree that bloomed every spring without anyone asking it to. There had been a husband, too, though calling him that felt generous now. He had been a man who made promises easily and kept them rarely. When he left, he took the bank accounts, the car, and the fiction that everything had been fine. What he could not take was the child. Miriam's daughter, Cass, was 7 years old. She had her father's stubborn chin and her mother's eyes, the kind of eyes that paid attention to things. She had not cried when they lost the house. She had sat on the front step of the rental they could no longer afford and watched the movers carry out the last box with the quiet gravity of a child who has already understood that the world is capable of great cruelty and has decided, without being told, not to let it swallow her whole. Miriam had looked at her daughter's face in that moment and felt something harden inside her chest. Not coldness, not despair, but something more like resolve. She would not let this be the end of their story. She had been telling herself that for 11 nights. The problem with resolve was that it required something to resolve toward. And as October deepened and the nights cooled and the shelter's 30-day limit approached like a slow-moving wall, Miriam was running out of options with any kind of shape to them, and the jobs she applied for called back slowly, or not at all. The apartment applications she submitted required deposits she did not have. The family she might have asked for help had scattered over the years into lives too complicated to interrupt, or so it felt. She was not a woman who asked easily. That was perhaps her greatest flaw and her most stubborn virtue in equal measure. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the envelope arrived at the shelter's mail desk, forwarded twice and creased from the journey. Her name was typed on the front in the formal way that meant a law firm. She stood at the front desk of the shelter and held it for a long moment before opening it, half expecting it to be another debt collector, another institution informing her of something she already owed. Instead, it was the office of an estate attorney in a county she barely recognized, informing her that a distant relative, a great-uncle she had met exactly once at a family gathering more than 30 years ago, had passed away. He had left behind one asset. The attorney's letter described it in 2 sentences that Miriam read 3 times to make sure she had not misunderstood. The property was located on Sutter Creek Road in the foothills east of the valley. It was a former commercial sawmill operation, decommissioned in 1987, condemned by the county in 2009, and currently assessed by the county tax authority at a value of $6. $6. She turned the page over, as if there might be more written on the back. There was not. There was only a phone number and a request to contact the office to sign the transfer paperwork. She called from the shelter's common room, sitting in the corner near the window, where the signal was strongest, while 3 other women watched a cooking program on a mounted television with the volume too high. The attorney was a dry man with a measured voice who explained things in the neutral tone of someone accustomed to delivering news that meant very different things to different people. The property was large by acreage, he said, but the structures were extensively damaged. The county had placed a condemnation notice on the main mill building following a partial roof collapse and had assessed it as a liability rather than an asset. Several previous heirs had declined to accept the transfer, as the cost of maintaining and insuring a condemned property technically exceeded its county-assessed value. There were also 2 years of unpaid property taxes amounting to roughly $340, which would transfer with the deed. She asked him plainly, "Is it worth anything?" He paused in the careful way of a man who has been trained not to give opinions about things outside his lane. "I'm an estate attorney," he said. "I can only tell you what the county has assessed." She asked him how long she had to decide. 30 days before the property reverted to the county and was placed in the tax sale inventory. She thanked him and sat for a long time after the call ended, holding the phone in her lap and staring at the cooking show without seeing it. The woman beside her was crying quietly about something. The lemon tree in the yard she used to own had never cost her anything. It had simply been there, patient and generous, producing more than she ever needed, asking for nothing in return. She thought about that tree for a long time. She thought about what it meant to own land, even ruined land, even condemned and worthless land. She thought about her daughter on the bench outside with 2 canvas bags. She called the attorney back that same afternoon. The drive out to Sutter Creek Road took just under 2 hours on roads that became progressively narrower and less confident the further east they went, as though the pavement itself was uncertain about continuing. Miriam borrowed a car from a woman at the shelter who had a generous heart and a 15-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard and good tires. She brought Cass because there was nowhere else to leave her, and also because Miriam had already decided, in some private part of herself, that whatever she was going to do next, her daughter should be present for the beginning of it. Cass sat in the passenger seat with her knees drawn up and watched the valley give way to foothill oak and dry grass, and the occasional structure that suggested habitation more than it confirmed it. She did not ask many questions. That was one of the things about her daughter that Miriam found both comforting and unsettling. Cass gathered information the way some children gathered rocks, selecting carefully, turning things over in her hands before deciding what to keep. The property announced itself not with a sign or a gate, but with a change in the air, a smell that arrived before any visible landmark did. It was the smell of old wood and iron and something deeper, and the dark mineral scent of creek water and rotting bark and decades of labor soaked into the earth. Then the trees thinned, and the road ended at a rusted cattle gate that stood half open, not from invitation, but from neglect, its post sunk and tilted, the chain that once held it looped on the ground like a shed skin. Beyond the gate, the land opened into a wide clearing that might once have been organized and purposeful. Now it was the landscape of a long pause. Weeds had risen chest-high in the summer and then fallen over on themselves with the first cold rains, lying flat and matted like the remains of something that had tried to reclaim the place and given up. Lengths of rusted chain were visible in the grass, too heavy to have been carried off by casual thieves. A section of conveyor belt, its rubber cracked and split, would lay across a mound of overgrown debris near what had once been a loading yard. And at the back of the clearing, set against a rising hillside dark with fir and madrone, was the mill. It was larger than Miriam had imagined. She was not sure why she had imagined it small. Perhaps because the county's assessment of $6 had suggested something insignificant, something that could be packed into a box and dismissed. The mill was not small. It was a long industrial building, 2 stories in the central section, with flanking structures attached on either side, like the arms of something that had once embraced the hillside. The walls were board and batten, the boards dark with weathering and in places missing altogether, leaving gaps through which the interior was visible as pure shadow. And the roof of the main section had collapsed inward at the eastern end, the corrugated metal folded down in a concave depression that had held the weight of several winters before finally surrendering. But the western section still stood, its roof intact, its walls upright, as though the building had decided to give up only partially, to yield on the far side and hold fast on the near one. Cass got out of the car before Miriam did. She stood in the long autumn grass with her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at the mill the way she had looked at the moving boxes, not with grief, not with judgment, but with the attention of someone taking inventory. "It's big," she said. "Yes," Miriam agreed. "Was it your family's?" Miriam looked at the building for a moment. Distantly, she said. A man she had met once at a party when she was 12 had made this, or worked in it, or owned it. She could not remember which. She had never thought about it again until 11 days ago. She pulled the property description from her bag and read the boundaries again. Just under 20 acres, including the mill complex, a secondary structure identified in old county records as a foreman's cabin, and a seasonal creek that ran along the northern property line. She folded the paper back and walked toward the mill. The ground shifted beneath her feet as she moved, soft in some places where moisture had pooled under the matted grass, firmer near the old concrete pads that had once held equipment. She could trace the history of the place in the shapes left behind, the regular spacing of post holes, the compacted earth of a path worn by repeated foot traffic, still visible beneath the weeds, like a sentence remembered even after the page had been torn away. She reached the main entrance of the western section, which was a large sliding door on a horizontal track, the kind used for moving equipment rather than people. The track was rusted, but present. The door itself had slid partly open, whether by accident or design she could not tell, leaving a gap wide enough to enter sideways. She stood at the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The interior was vast and dim, a cathedral of industrial intent. Rafters crossed overhead at the height of a 2-story structure. Their joints still sound where the wood had stayed dry. Dust and old chaff lay in drifts against the walls, and the floor was concrete, cracked in places but intact, unstreaked with oil stains that had gone the color of old iron. The machinery was still there, most of it at least. She had not expected that. She had assumed that anything of value would have been stripped in the years since the operation closed, sold off or salvaged, or carried away piece by piece by the kind of men who made their living in the spaces between ownership. But the equipment remained, enormous and silent. The main saw rig occupied the center of the floor space, a long feed table leading to a blade, housing that stood taller than she was. The blade itself had been removed, only the housing remained, an iron frame with the precision of a manufactured thing, corroded but fundamentally intact. Guide rails still ran the length of the feed table. Pulleys hung overhead, their belts long since rotted away, but the hardware itself still mounted in position. There was a strange dignity to it, not the dignity of beauty, but the dignity of purpose remembered. These machines had done something real, had transformed raw trees into the lumber that built houses and barns and floors that people walked on for generations. The labor of this place was embedded in structures all across the region, anonymous and invisible, as most labor was. Miriam walked the length of the floor slowly. She was not looking for anything in particular. She was trying to feel the place, to understand what kind of weight it carried, whether it was the weight of ruin or the weight of something that could still bear being stood upon. Near the eastern wall, where the collapsed section of roof had allowed weather to enter, the floor was damaged. A wide section had heaved and cracked from freeze and thaw cycles, the concrete lifting in slabs like the pages of a book pushed upward from beneath. In the center of this damaged section, where the deepest crack ran, Miriam could see down into the space beneath the floor. She knelt and looked. There was a subfloor level, a lower space, not a crawl space exactly, but something more intentional. A pit, the kind used in mill operations to house blade mechanics and allow access to equipment from below. She looked at it for a long time. Then she heard Cass behind her. She had followed her in. "What's down there?" Cass asked. Miriam straightened. She did not answer immediately. "Machinery," she said. "For the saws. It's where they did the maintenance." Cass looked at the crack in the floor with her characteristic focused attention. "Can you get in it?" "Not yet," Miriam said. She said it the way you say. Not yet, when you mean eventually. When you mean you have already decided something even if you haven't said it aloud. She drove back to the shelter that evening with Cass asleep in the passenger seat, the girl's head tilted against the window, the valley lights spreading out below them as they came down from the hills. Miriam drove in silence and thought about what she had seen. She thought about the $6 valuation. She thought about the $340 in back taxes. She thought about the fact that every other heir had declined the transfer and walked away. She thought about what it meant that they had walked away from 20 acres and a standing structure, even a condemned one, for the price of nothing. The people did not walk away from land unless the land frightened them or cost them something they were not willing to pay. She thought about which of those things it was. Back at the shelter, after Cass was asleep on the cot and the common room had gone quiet, Miriam sat at the small table near the window and wrote out her finances on a sheet of notebook paper. She had done this before, many times, always arriving at the same conclusion, that the numbers did not add up. But tonight, she was approaching the numbers from a different angle. Not what they had, but what the absolute minimum was. The attorney's fee to complete the transfer was waived because the estate was so small as to qualify for a simplified process. The back taxes were $340, which she could borrow from the Emergency Assistance Fund the shelter administered, repayable without interest. That left the question of what she would do with a condemned property on 20 acres of foothill land that she could not afford to insure, could not sell for anything meaningful, and could not legally occupy in its current state. She stared at the paper. Then she wrote something at the bottom, separate from the numbers. She wrote, "The door was still open. It had been open for years. The previous heirs left it that way." She looked at what she had written for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and went to sleep. She called the attorney the next morning and told him she would accept the transfer. The reaction from the people around her was not dramatic. It was quiet and consistent, which was in some ways worse than drama, because it suggested that no one who knew her situation believed the decision merited serious concern. The woman at the shelter who had lent her the car said, with genuine kindness, that she hoped it would work out, but that Miriam should be careful about sinking time and energy into something the county had already given up on. A social worker she had been assigned to looked at the property description and said that derelict commercial structures often came with environmental liabilities, and that she should consult an attorney, which she could not afford, before assuming the land was clean. A woman from her former neighborhood, who had once been a close friend and was now a distant acquaintance whom she occasionally texted, said that she admired her spirit, which was the polite way of saying she thought Miriam was making a mistake. None of them were cruel. That was the thing she had to keep reminding herself. None of them were dismissing her out of malice. They were looking at the facts as they understood them, and the facts were not encouraging. She was a woman with no steady income, no housing, and a 7-year-old child, and she had just accepted the legal responsibility for a 20-acre property the county had condemned. Looked at one way, it was the action of someone in despair making an impulsive gesture toward Hope. She understood why it looked that way. She chose not to be diminished by it. The transfer paperwork was completed within the week. The county tax authority accepted the back payment from the shelter's emergency fund, which Miriam filled out the loan paperwork for without ceremony. And on a Thursday morning in late October, she stood at the county recorder's office and received a deed bearing her name and her daughter's name, and the address on Sutter Creek Road, and a legal description of boundaries that enclosed 20 acres of foothill land and all the structures upon it. The deed was a single page. It felt lighter than it should have. The first time she and Cass went back to the property together with the intention of staying, they brought what they could carry. 2 sleeping bags, a camping stove, water jugs, food for a week, tools, a battery lantern, a small tarp, and the 2 canvas bags that had followed them everywhere since the house. They could not legally inhabit the condemned building, but the foreman's cabin, which was a separate structure up the hill from the mill, had not been included in the condemnation notice. It was small and had not been maintained, but its walls were sound, and its roof, while mossy and dark with damp, did not leak. It had a wood stove. The chimney needed cleaning, which Miriam spent an afternoon doing with a long-handled brush and a cloth over her face, emerging covered in creosote and satisfied. There was a hand pump at the side of the cabin connected to a shallow well. The water it produced ran rust-colored for several minutes before clearing. Miriam filled a jug and let it settle and tested a small amount. It tasted of iron and cold, which was not terrible. She would have it tested properly when she could. Cass adapted with the ease of a child whose understanding of what constituted adequate shelter had been recalibrated in recent months. She swept the cabin floor with a broom they had brought and arranged their sleeping bags on the wooden sleeping platform along one wall and set up a small shelf for her books, which numbered 4 and were held together with a rubber band. She did not complain. She asked practical questions. Was there a school nearby? Miriam said she would find out. Could they have a fire in the stove? Miriam said yes, as soon as she was sure the chimney was clear. Was the mill dangerous? Miriam looked at her daughter for a moment, and then said, "Some parts of it, yes. That's why we don't go into the eastern section. But the western section is mostly sound. They spent the first 3 days doing what the land required, clearing pathways through the overgrown clearing, assessing which structures were stable and which were not, walking the property line to understand what they had. The seasonal creek along the northern edge was running, fed by the recent rains, its voice a constant low murmur that Miriam found she oriented toward in the morning, the way she had once oriented toward coffee. The 20 acres were more varied than they had appeared from the road. The lower section, where the mill complex sat, was flat and clear, the land having been leveled by whoever built the operation decades ago. The upper section climbed the hillside in a series of natural terraces, dense with oak and madrone, and, in one sheltered bowl near the top of the property, a stand of second-growth fir that was straight and close and had clearly been left to grow without interference for at least 30 years. She stood at the edge of that stand on the second day and ran her hand along the bark of one of the trees and felt the living weight of it, the deep patience of a thing that had been growing in silence while the world outside went through its upheavals. She thought about the mill below. She thought about what all of this had once been and what it might become. She was not naive. She knew that having land meant nothing by itself. Land did not pay for groceries or school fees or medical bills. Land did not prevent the cold from getting in or the months from passing. She needed income. She needed stability. She needed those things the way everyone needed them, but urgently and without the luxury of waiting for the ideal circumstances to arrive. But she also knew, having spent the past several months watching everything she had assumed was solid turn out to be rented or borrowed, or conditional, that there was a difference between owning something and merely occupying it. The deed in her jacket pocket meant something that she was still learning to name. She started going back to the mill in the early mornings while Cass slept. She brought the battery lantern and set it on the old feed table and walked the space methodically, mapping it in her mind, the way she had learned to map things when she had worked, years ago, as an office manager for a small construction company, understanding space through its purpose, and seeing what each area had been designed to do and imagining what it could be asked to do instead. The western section was approximately 4,000 square feet of covered, concrete-floored space. The roof was intact. The walls were weathered, but structurally adequate. The electrical system was dead, but the wiring was still in place. A well-mounted breaker panel near the main entrance was labeled in a faded hand that someone had taken care with, each circuit identified in small, neat lettering. She photographed everything with her phone, moving through the space with the lantern and the careful attention of someone taking inventory for a purpose not yet fully formed. On the fourth morning, she returned to the blade pit. The crack in the damaged section of the floor ran along one edge of what had once been an access panel, on a section of the concrete floor that had been poured separately and was meant to be lifted. She could see the remains of iron handles, corroded but present, set flush into the concrete on opposite sides of the panel. She brought the tools she had and spent an hour clearing debris from around the edges of the panel, breaking away the material that had fused with freeze and thaw into the surrounding floor. The panel was approximately 4 feet by 6 feet, heavier than she could lift alone. She drove to the hardware store in the nearest town with the last $40 she had available outside the shelter loan, bought a small pry bar and a short length of steel rod, and came back. She worked slowly and carefully. The panel did not come up easily. It had been sealed for a long time, not deliberately, not with intent, but with the patient sealing that came from years of temperature change and mineral deposit and the simple weight of abandonment. She worked the pry bar into the edge and applied leverage with controlled patience, moving around the perimeter, working each corner a little before moving to the next. The concrete groaned. The sound carried in the empty building in a way that made her pause each time, the sound too large for the silence around it. On the third day of working at it, the panel shifted, just slightly, a quarter-inch of movement that allowed light to enter the crack along the edge. The smell that came out was not what she expected. She had expected damp and decay and the sour smell of standing water and rot. Instead, what rose from below was dry and cool and mineral, on a deep underground cold that had been held in place by the concrete lid above it for longer than she could guess. Dry. Whatever was down there was dry. She set the lantern close and looked into the gap. The space below was deep, deeper than a standard maintenance pit. She could not see the bottom. She went back to the cabin and got a flashlight and returned and pointed it into the crack. The beam went down perhaps 12 feet before it hit a floor. The floor below was not bare earth. It was stone, natural stone, the bedrock of the hillside that the mill had been built against. And on that stone, she could see, just barely in the edge of the beam, the outline of something she could not yet identify. Something that did not belong to the random geometry of a maintenance space. She straightened up. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. She was a practical woman. She did not leap to conclusions. She did not allow herself the luxury of imagination before she had facts. But standing in the gray light of that October morning, in the hollow shell of a mill she had acquired for $6, with the smell of old stone rising from beneath her feet, and a flashlight beam catching the edge of something that had been sealed away in the dark for decades, Miriam felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like something was about to change. She went back to the cabin. She made coffee on the camp stove and sat with it outside and watched the creek run along the northern edge of the property, the sound of it clean and constant and indifferent to everything. Cass woke and came outside with her hair tangled and her boots unlaced and sat beside her mother on the step. "What were you doing?" she asked, seeing the dirt on her mother's hands. "Working," Miriam said. "Down in the mill?" Cass asked. Miriam looked at her. The morning light was coming through the fir trees at the top of the property, angled and golden. "Yes," she said. "I found something." "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Miriam said. She drank her coffee. She thought about the sealed panel and the dry, cold air, and the outline at the edge of the flashlight beam. She thought about the other heirs who had declined the transfer and walked away. She thought about whether they had ever gone into the mill, and if they had, whether they had stood over that crack and looked down. She thought about what it might mean that they hadn't stayed. "I'm going to need more light," she said, "and help moving something heavy." Cass looked at her mother with those steady eyes, and then looked at the mill, its dark walls and its intact western roof, and its collapsed eastern end, and the long history of labor embedded in every beam and bolt of it. "Can I help?" she asked. Miriam looked at her daughter. "I don't see why not," she said. They spent the rest of that morning in the mill together, Miriam with the pry bar and the steel rod, and Cass holding the lantern at the angle that sent the most light into the gap. Cass did not talk while she worked. She watched and held steady, and moved the lantern when her mother pointed and asked her to. There was something about the way the child adapted to the silence of the work that made Miriam's chest ache in a way she could not fully name. Cass was 7. She should have been in school, and she would be. Miriam had already started the enrollment process at the district that served this part of the county, a paperwork trail that required the deed as proof of residency in a process she was still navigating. But this morning, in this moment, her daughter was here, holding a lantern in an abandoned mill, while her mother tried to lift a concrete panel that had not moved in decades, and the fact that Cass was steady and present and unfrightened felt like the most important thing in the world. The panel came up on the third morning of concentrated effort. Not all the way, not in one clean motion, but enough. Miriam worked the steel rod beneath one edge and used the pry bar as a lever against a block of wood she had found in the debris near the eastern wall. And with a sound like a long-held breath finally released, the panel lifted 4 inches and held. The smell that came from below was more distinct now, no longer just mineral cold, but something with texture to it, the scent of iron and a faint resinous note that she associated, without knowing why, with old manufactured things rather than natural ones. She shone the flashlight into the gap, and this time the angle was better. She could see more of the floor below, the natural bedrock surface, and the thing at the edge of the beam resolved itself just slightly, not into clarity, but into a shape that was unmistakably rectangular, deliberate, placed. She eased the panel down and sat back on her heels, and breathed. She was not a woman given to fantasy. She had been a bookkeeper's daughter. Her father had taught her, or with the quiet insistence of a man who had grown up with nothing and built a modest life through arithmetic and patience, that the world was what the numbers said it was. Not more and not less. You did not spend money you did not have. You did not count on things that hadn't yet arrived. You moved from fact to fact, and you let the facts guide you, and you did not get distracted by what you hoped might be true before you had established what was actually true. So she wrote down what she knew on the back of the property description sheet. 1. The maintenance pit was deeper than a standard access space. 2. The air below was dry, which suggested either good natural drainage or intentional insulation from moisture. 3. The floor was bedrock, which meant nothing had been poured down there, that whatever was in that space was in a natural stone-floored cavity at the base of the hillside, within the footprint of the mill. 4. There was at least one rectangular object visible on that floor, oriented with the precision of something placed rather than fallen. She looked at the 4 facts. She called a woman she had known years ago, before everything had unraveled. A woman named Deb, who had worked in salvage and reclamation, and who had once told her that abandoned industrial properties were full of surprises, most of them unpleasant, but occasionally the other thing. The phone rang 4 times before Deb picked up, and when Miriam explained where she was, and what she had, and what she had seen, Deb was quiet for a moment, and then said, "You need to get that panel fully open. You need to get proper light down there. Don't put your hands on anything until you know what you're looking at." Miriam asked her if she knew anyone with a portable lift or a chain hoist she could borrow. Deb said she did. The equipment arrived 2 days later in the back of a truck driven by a man named Ray, who was somewhere between 60 and 80, with the brown, precise hands of someone who had spent his life working with machinery and respected it. He assessed the situation without drama, rigged a simple chain hoist to one of the overhead beams using a come-along to test the beam's integrity first, and had the panel swinging free within 40 minutes. He set it aside on the concrete floor with a controlled care that Miriam noticed. He did not treat the panel as debris. He treated it as a component that had been serving a function and deserved to be set down properly. So the opening in the floor was roughly 4 feet by 6. Looking straight down into it with the portable work light Ray had also brought, the space below resolved itself into something she had not fully anticipated. It was not a maintenance pit in the conventional sense. Yes, it had been accessed from above, and yes, it was positioned beneath where the main blade rig had stood. But it was far too deep and far too wide to have been purely functional. The natural bedrock formed its floor and its walls on 3 sides, the stone dark and dry and striated with the faint mineral bands of ancient compression. The 4th side, the side that faced the hillside, was not stone. It was built, heavy timber framing and rough planking, the kind of construction that was made to last rather than to look finished. And set into that built wall were shelves, wide, deep shelves, the kind that held weight rather than objects of display, their timber thick and their brackets iron. The shelves were not empty. Ray, standing beside her at the edge of the opening, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, in the careful voice of a man who had seen many things and had learned that underreaction served better than the alternative, "Well, that's something." "What's down there?" Miriam said. She said it in a voice that was level. She was proud of how level it was. "Crates," he said, "and some boxes. And those things at the back, I'm going to need to get closer to tell you what those are." He rigged a rope ladder from the overhead beam and went down first, which Miriam did not argue with, because she recognized that he had the experience for it. She watched the top of his gray head descend, and then the sound of his boots on the stone below, and then silence, except for the sound of him moving around down there, and the sound of her own heartbeat, which was doing something it had not done in a long time. He came back up without having touched anything. His expression was controlled in the way of a man choosing his words with care. "The crates are old," he said. "Mill era. Probably used for equipment storage, spare blades, that kind of thing. Some of them may be empty, hard to say. But the boxes at the back, those are not mill equipment. They're stacked against the far wall, and they're wrapped. Something wrapped them deliberately. Canvas or oilcloth, I think. Been there a long time. And those things I mentioned at the back, the ones I couldn't identify from up here." He paused. "Well, you're going to want to see those yourself." She climbed down the rope ladder with the work light in one hand, and the same deliberate care she had given everything since arriving on this property. The stone floor was solid and level beneath her boots, The space was larger than it had appeared from above, extending further back under the hillside than the footprint of the mill suggested it should. The air was cool and dry, and carried that iron and resin scent she had noticed before, stronger now, specific. She turned the light toward the far wall. The shelves along the built timber wall held the crates Ray had described, wooden boxes of the kind associated with industrial storage, their lids nailed shut, their sides marked with the faded stencil of a supply company whose name she did not recognize. Some were clearly empty by their aspect. Others sat with a weight to them, their joints tight, their corners reinforced with iron strapping in the deliberate way of boxes built for contents with value. She moved the light to the far back corner, where the stone of the hillside made a natural alcove. The shapes there were not boxes. They were stacked in rows, 3 deep and several high, each one wrapped in what looked like treated canvas that had gone dark with age. The wrapping had been done carefully, lapped and tucked, in the way a person wrapped something they intended to store for a long time and did not want moisture or air to reach. Each wrapped form was roughly the size and shape of a thick dictionary or a brick. Regular, consistent, deliberate. She crouched in front of the nearest one and looked at it without touching it for a long time. Then she reached out and pressed her fingers against the canvas surface and felt what was beneath it. Dense, smooth beneath the fabric, heavy in a way that had nothing to do with size. She lifted the edge of the canvas at one corner, where the fold had loosened with age, just enough to see what was inside. The light from the work lamp touched it, and the surface that was revealed was not wood, and was not iron, and was not stone. It was the color of afternoon sunlight on still water. She let the canvas fall back and stood up, and put her free hand flat against the stone wall of the hillside, and stood very still. Ray, looking down from the opening above, called down to her, "You all right?" She was looking at the wrapped forms, at the rows of them, at the careful and deliberate way they had been stacked and covered and sealed away in a dry stone chamber beneath the floor of a mill that had been operating for decades above them. She was thinking about the previous heirs who had looked at this property and declined to accept the transfer. She was thinking about what a condemned sawmill with $6 county assessment looked like from the outside, and what it might contain if you went in far enough, if you were willing to get your hands dirty, if you were willing to lift the panel that nobody else had lifted. She was all right. She was more than all right. She was standing at the bottom of the beginning of something she did not yet have words for. "Yes," she called back up to Ray. She kept her voice steady. "I'm all right. Can you come down here?" No, he came down and stood beside her in the alcove and looked at the wrapped forms, and then he looked at her with the expression of a man who has seen enough of the world to know that some things cannot be approached with rushed hands or careless assumptions. "Don't unwrap anything else tonight," he said. "I know," she said. "You need someone who knows what they're looking at." "I know," she said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what this property cost you?" $6, she said. He nodded slowly. He looked around the chamber, at the shelves, at the stacked forms, at the natural stone walls that had held this space undisturbed, while the mill above it went from industry to silence to condemnation, and back to the silence again. Some properties, he said, are cheap for a reason, and some are cheap for a different reason entirely. And she knew what he meant. The previous heirs had looked at the surface of a thing and seen what the surface offered, which was nothing. They had not gone down into the dark. They had not lifted the panels that did not want to move. They had not stood in the cold October morning with dirty hands and a borrowed car and the absolute refusal to accept that nothing was the only thing available. She thought about her daughter, up in the cabin, making oatmeal on the camp stove, and reading one of her 4 books with the rubber band around them. She thought about the lemon tree in the yard of the house she used to own. She thought about what it felt like to hold a deed with her name on it, even a deed for something the county had assessed at $6 and every other heir had refused. She looked at the wrapped forms one more time. Then she turned off the work light and climbed back up the rope ladder into the gray morning light of the mill. She sat on the edge of the opening and looked at the mill around her, at the rafters and the rusted hardware and the old feed table and the ghost of the blade that had once processed the raw timber of the surrounding hills into something the world could use. She looked at all of that, and she thought about what she was going to do next. And the thought was not frightening, and it was not dizzying. It was simply the next thing, the next fact in the sequence of facts that had been unfolding since the day an envelope arrived at the shelter's mail desk with her name typed on the front. She was going to find someone who knew what they were looking at, and she was going to take the next step with the same care she had taken every step since arriving at this property. She was not going to rush, and she was not going to tell the wrong people. She was going to be as deliberate about this as the person had been who had once sealed those wrapped forms in their oilcloth coverings and stacked them in those careful rows in that dry stone alcove, and then built a concrete panel over the opening and gone away and left them in the care of the dark. The creek ran along the northern edge of the property, its voice steady and indifferent. The fir trees at the top of the hillside held their silence. The mill stood around her with the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time. She got up and walked out into the gray morning light, and the October air hit her face clean and cold. And somewhere up the hill in the cabin, her daughter was alive and well and making oatmeal, and the world was about to become a different kind of place than it had been 11 days ago when she was counting $4.63 into her palm at a convenience store counter. She walked up the hill toward the cabin. She had things to do. The man she needed was not easy to find, not because he was hidden, but because the kind of expertise she was looking for existed in a very small world, and that world did not advertise itself in the way that locksmiths and plumbers did. She spent 2 days making calls from the property, standing near the creek where the signal was strongest, and working through a chain of referrals that moved from Deb to a retired assayer in the valley, to a woman who ran an estate liquidation business out of Sacramento, to finally a man named Gerald Foss, who had spent 30 years as a certified precious metals appraiser and now worked independently out of an office above a print shop in a town 40 minutes south. She told him only what was necessary. She had inherited a property with a sealed storage space beneath the floor. There were items in that space she could not identify. She needed someone who could tell her what she was looking at before she made any decisions. He asked her one question. "Are the items under lock?" "No," she said. "Under concrete." There was a pause on the line that felt like the pause of a man recalibrating something. Then he said he could come out Thursday, and he arrived exactly when he said he would, which told her something. He was a compact man in his late 60s, with the unhurried movements of someone who had stopped being impressed by things many years ago, and had replaced that impressionability with something more useful, which was precision. He brought a case of instruments and a flashlight, with a beam so strong it was almost a physical object, and a pair of nitrile gloves he put on before he went down the rope ladder. He was in the space below for 22 minutes. Miriam knew because she counted them. When he came back up, he did not say anything immediately. He removed the gloves with care and rolled them together and put them in his case and closed the latches. Then he stood at the edge of the opening and looked at the floor for a moment, in the way of a man deciding how to begin. "How long have you owned this property?" he asked. 11 days, she said. He looked up at her. His expression was not dramatic. It was the expression of a man arriving at a fact and accepting it. And before that? She explained the transfer, the estate, the great-uncle she had met once. She explained the $6 assessment. She explained the back taxes. She told him about the other heirs who had declined. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up his case and walked toward the mill entrance, and she followed him. He set the case down on the feed table and stood looking out through the gap in the sliding door at the clearing and the gray October sky. The wrapped forms at the back of the lower chamber, he said. I unwrapped a corner of one to test the surface. I hope that was acceptable. She said it was. What you have down there, he said, is gold. He said it the way a doctor says a diagnosis, with the care of a person who understands that words like that land differently than other words, and that the landing needs to be controlled. Refined gold, cast into bars. The form factor is consistent with commercial production, probably mid-century, possibly earlier. The surface I tested has the color, weight, and malleability response consistent with high-purity gold in the range of 22 to 24 karat. I would need to run a full assay to give you numbers, but based on what I observed, based on the quantity stacked in that alcove, you are not talking about a small amount of money. She stood very still. The mill was quiet around them. Outside, a jay called from somewhere in the madrone trees. How much? She said. He was quiet for a moment. I don't want to speculate without the assay, but the stacking arrangement in the alcove, assuming the forms at the back are consistent with the one I tested, I counted what appeared to be a significant number of units. If each unit is a standard weight, and if the purity holds, you are looking at something that could be substantial. Very substantially substantial. She had never heard that construction before. Very substantially substantial. She thought it was probably the most careful way she had ever heard a man try not to say a number. She asked him about the crates. He said he had not opened any of the crates. He had noted that at least several of them had weight to them. He could not say more without opening them. She asked him what the next step was. He told her. Full assay of a representative sample, which would require removing several bars from the space under controlled conditions. Legal documentation of the discovery, which he strongly advised her to begin immediately, not for the purposes of publicity, but for her own protection. A consultation with an attorney, specifically one with experience in property and found property law, which was a distinct area she might not have considered. Found property law, she said. He nodded. When items of significant value are discovered on land by the property owner, there are legal questions about provenance, about whether prior owners or their estates have any claim, about tax implications. These questions are resolvable, he said, but they are better resolved with counsel before anything else happens. She asked him to recommend someone. He gave her a name, and he said he would come back Thursday of the following week to perform the assay if she wanted to proceed that way. He said she should not move anything in the meantime and should not tell anyone what she had found. She asked him directly, "What do you think it's worth?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "If it is what I believe it is, and if the quantity is consistent with what I observed, you are looking at something in the range of significant millions. The gold market fluctuates, but the base value of the metal is what it is. I will give you a precise number after the assay." She thanked him. She walked him to his car. She stood in the clearing and watched him drive away down the narrow road until the sound of his engine faded into the trees. So then she sat down on the front step of the foreman's cabin and put her hands in her lap and looked at the mill across the clearing for a very long time. Cass came out and sat beside her. She had been in the cabin during the appraiser's visit, as Miriam had asked. She had done her schoolwork on the wooden table, the worksheets her new teacher had sent home with her on her second day at the district school, which was small and slightly underfunded, and had a librarian who had taken an immediate interest in a girl who had 4 books held together with a rubber band. "What did he say?" Cass asked. Miriam looked at her daughter. She thought about what it meant to tell a 7-year-old something that might not be true yet, that required verification, that the appraiser himself had hedged with layers of careful language. When he said we might have found something important, she said. Like what? Miriam was quiet for a moment. Like something that changes things, she said. Cass absorbed this. She looked at the mill the way she looked at most things, with patient attention. Then she said, "Good. Things should change." Miriam put her arm around her daughter's shoulders and felt the solid, small warmth of her, and thought about the shelter and the cots and the $4.63 and the envelope with the attorney's return address. She thought about all the steps between that envelope and this step, each one taken without certainty, without a map, without anyone telling her it was the right direction. She tightened her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Yes," she said. They should. The attorney Gerald Foss had recommended was a woman named Patricia Holst, who practiced out of a converted Victorian house in the county seat, and whose specialty, according to her website, was property law and what she called complex asset recovery. When Miriam called and explained the situation in careful outline, Patricia's response was immediate and professional. She could see her the following Monday. In the meantime, Miriam should document everything, photograph everything, and move nothing. Miriam had already been doing those things. The meeting with Patricia Holst lasted 3 hours. It was the most focused conversation Miriam had engaged in since before her marriage had ended, which was a recognition that landed with a small, private sting. When she sat across from a woman in her early 50s, with careful posture, and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and went through everything in order. The estate letter, the deed transfer, the property history, the discovery of the panel, the appraiser's visit and preliminary assessment. She presented copies of all her documentation. She answered every question directly. Patricia listened, asked precise questions, and took notes by hand in a leather notebook. At the end of the 3 hours, she sat back and said the following things. The deed transfer was clean. Miriam was the unambiguous legal owner of the property, and everything on or in it as of the date of transfer. The fact that no prior owner had claimed the contents of the lower chamber was legally significant in her favor. The question of whether the original depositor of the gold, if that was what it was, had any surviving heirs with a claim was theoretically possible, but practically very difficult to establish, particularly given the age of the deposit and the absence of any documentation connecting the stored items to a specific individual or entity. What she needed to do was file an inventory with the county as soon as the assay was complete, which was a legal requirement for found property of significant value on private land. She needed to report the discovery to the IRS, which would trigger a tax assessment on the fair market value at the time of discovery. This was unavoidable, and Miriam should plan for it. But it was also manageable, and Patricia had handled similar situations before. The most important thing, Patricia said, was to control the timeline. Once this became public, and it would become public, the situation would change in ways that could be managed but not prevented. There would be interest from parties claiming prior connection to the property. There might be attempts to establish competing claims. There might be pressure from various directions. The way to survive all of that was to have clean, documented, legally defensible paperwork established before any of it started. Miriam asked how long she had before it needed to become public. Patricia said, "As long as you can keep it private. Every day of quiet is a day you use to build your legal foundation." Miriam drove back to the property with a list of things to do that was long and detailed and not frightening because it was a list of actions, and actions were something she understood. But she had always been better with actions than with waiting. The assay took place the following Thursday as scheduled. Gerald Foss came back with a more comprehensive kit and spent 4 hours in the lower chamber, working methodically through a representative sample of the stored forms. He tested bars from different positions in the stacking arrangement, from different rows, from the front and the back of the alcove. He documented each test with the precision of a man who understood that his findings would eventually need to withstand scrutiny. Miriam waited in the mill above. She had brought work to do, a notebook in which she was drafting a log of every action she had taken regarding the property since accepting the transfer. Date, time, description, witness if present. It was the kind of documentation she had once maintained for a construction company's office, the kind of careful paper trail that mattered when something was disputed. She was building it now for the same reason. Not because she expected a dispute, because disputes found you whether you expected them or not. Cass was at school. Ray came by in the early afternoon, and Miriam told him the appraiser was back. He nodded and leaned against the mill wall and said nothing, which was the particular kind of companionship that was more useful than conversation. When Gerald Foss emerged from the lower chamber the second time, his expression was the expression of a man whose hypothesis had been confirmed. He sat down on the feed table with his notes and went through the results methodically. The purity of the tested samples was consistent across the board. 22 to 24 carat, with 3 of the samples testing at the high end of that range. The weight of each bar, measured individually, was consistent with a standard commercial ingot form. The total count of units in the alcove, which he had been able to establish precisely this visit, was 243. He wrote the number down and turned the notebook so she could see it. 243. He told her the current spot price of gold per troy ounce. He told her the approximate troy ounce weight of a standard ingot at the purity level they were looking at. He did the arithmetic on the page in front of her, step by step, because he was that kind of man. The number he arrived at was not expressed in thousands, and it was expressed in hundreds of millions. She looked at the number for a long time. The pencil marks were very ordinary. The feed table beneath the notebook was scarred and worn. The mill around her was silent except for the sound of wind finding its way through the gaps in the western wall. She said, "That's the gold alone," he confirmed. "That is the gold alone, not including any value that may be contained in the crates." She thought about the crates, the ones with weight to them, their iron strapping tight, their contents unknown. She asked him to come back for the crates. He said he would. She sat alone in the mill after he drove away. The light was going, the late afternoon orange coming through the western gaps in the wall and moving across the concrete floor in long bars that reminded her of nothing so much as the pattern of cut lumber. The shadow playing the shape of something the building had once processed. She thought about the number. She thought about the shelter and the cots and the social worker who had worried about environmental liabilities. She thought about the woman who had lent her the car and said she hoped it would work out. She thought about the friend from the old neighborhood who had admired her spirit. She thought about the previous heirs, all of them, each one who had received the same letter from the same attorney and looked at the same $6 assessment and the same condemnation notice and the same liability language, and said, "No, thank you." She understood that she had not known. She had not bought this property because she suspected what was in it. She had accepted it because she had no other option that was not simply surrender, and surrender was not something she had been able to bring herself to choose. She had accepted a condemned sawmill for $6 and $340 in back taxes because it was land with her name on it, and that was more than she had anywhere else. And now she was sitting in that condemned sawmill with the number 243 ingots at 22 to 24 carat gold written in pencil in a retired appraiser's notebook. And the world was a different shape than it had been this morning. She let herself sit with that for exactly as long as it took the light to move all the way across the floor and go orange and then dim. Then she took out her phone and called Patricia Holst. It was not supposed to come out the way it did. Miriam had been careful. Patricia had been careful. Gerald Foss was the kind of man whose professional discretion was part of the value he offered. Ray did not talk. Cass did not know the numbers, only that something important had been found, and she was 7 and not inclined toward gossip. But a small town was a small town. Gerald Foss's truck had been seen at the property twice. The attorney's car had been noted in the driveway. A county record search, the kind that anyone could run for the price of a filing fee, showed the recent deed transfer. Someone, somewhere in that chain of small observations, had connected enough of the pieces to go looking for the rest of them. The first sign was a car parked on the road outside the gate, not obviously watching, just present. A silver sedan with a man inside it, who appeared to be looking at his phone. Miriam noticed it on a Tuesday morning when she walked down to get the mail from the rural box at the end of the property road. The car was there when she walked down, and still there when she walked back. The man did not look up. She mentioned it to Patricia that afternoon. Patricia said, "It's starting. Be ready." The second sign was a call from a man who introduced himself as a representative of a private land acquisition firm. He was pleasant, practiced, and unhurried. He told her that his firm had become aware that her property might be underutilized and that they had clients interested in foothill acreage in the region. He asked if she had given any thought to a sale and mentioned, with the offhand ease of someone accustomed to making large numbers sound casual, that they could offer significantly above the assessed value. She asked him what figure he had in mind. He named a number in the low hundreds of thousands. She thanked him politely and said she would think about it. She called Patricia immediately after. Patricia said, "Don't call them back. They know something, or they suspect something. Either way, they are not offering you fair value." The third sign came from a direction she had not expected. A woman appeared at her gate on a Wednesday afternoon, well-dressed and direct. Who introduced herself as the granddaughter of the man who had owned the property before Miriam's great-uncle had acquired it in 1962. She said she had been researching the property's history for personal reasons and had only recently discovered the deed transfer. She was very polite. She said she wasn't making any legal claims. She only wanted to talk. Miriam let her in through the gate, and they stood in the clearing near the mill and talked for 20 minutes while the creek made its sound in the trees to the north. The woman's name was Helen. She was in her early 60s, composed and direct and clearly intelligent. She asked about Miriam's plans for the property. She asked how long she had been in the area. She asked, with a careful naturalness that Miriam recognized as rehearsed, whether Miriam had done any work yet inside the mill building. Miriam said she had done a basic safety assessment. Helen nodded. She said that the property had a complicated history and that her family had always believed there were unresolved matters connected to it. She said this without specifics, in the way of someone testing a door before opening it. Miriam looked at her. She was a woman who had learned, in recent months, to read the space between what people said and what they meant, to hear the thing beneath the words. She told Helen that the property was privately held and that she was not in a position to discuss its details at this time. She said it pleasantly, and she said it clearly, and she held the gate open as Helen walked back to her car. She called Patricia on the way back up to the cabin. Patricia said, "She's not a random visitor. Get me her full name, and I'll run a background search." The calls from the acquisition firm increased. Different representatives, slightly different approaches, but the same underlying message. We want this property. The offers went up incrementally, suggesting that information was being gathered and assessed in real time somewhere on the other side of these conversations. First, the low hundreds of thousands. Then, a number approaching 500,000. Then a call that opened with the representative acknowledging that the property might have greater potential than its current assessment reflected, a phrasing so careful it was almost a compliment. Miriam documented every call, date, time, name if given, exact wording of the offer, her exact response. She asked Patricia, how did they find out? And Patricia said, maybe they didn't. Maybe they suspect. Maybe someone saw the vehicles and ran the deed and made an educated guess based on the property's history. Old industrial properties in foothill locations, deep foundations, sealed spaces. There are people who make careers out of finding these situations. What matters is that you are further along in the legal process than they are, and that's where we keep it. The crates were opened on a Saturday, with Gerald Foss present, and Patricia Holst on the phone, and Ray standing near the entrance to the lower chamber. Miriam had borrowed a better ladder by now, a proper aluminum one, and the work light had been supplemented by a second lamp on a portable stand that filled the stone chamber with a clean white light that made the alcove with its wrapped forms look almost staged, like something in a museum before the exhibit was dressed. The crates, opened one by one with careful tools that avoided damaging the contents or the containers, held a variety of items. Some were what they appeared to be, old spare parts for mill equipment, blades and bolts, and bearing housings, still coated in original grease. Several were empty, but 5 of the crates, the ones that had weight to them, the ones with the reinforced iron strapping, held something different. 3 held coins, not loose, but in rolls wrapped in oilcloth in the same meticulous way the gold bars had been wrapped. American gold coins, pre-1933, double eagles and eagles, and half eagles in denominations that had not been in common circulation for nearly a century. Gerald Foss handled each roll with focused attention and made notes in his ledger without speaking, but he would need time to assess them properly. But they were real, and they were gold, and they were in remarkable condition for their age, a condition that the dry, constant temperature environment of the stone chamber had helped preserve. The 4th crate held documents, not the documents of a business transaction or a personal estate, but maps, survey maps, hand-drawn in ink on paper that had survived the decades in the sealed environment, the way old things sometimes survived when they were well-made and well-protected. The maps showed the property, its boundaries, the creek, the mill structure, and beneath the mill structure, drawn with a precision that made clear the person who drew it had been there and had seen what was there, the chamber, the alcove, the arrangement of the stored items. Someone had mapped all of this, and someone had known exactly what was down here and had drawn it in careful ink and stored the drawing with the things the drawing described. Miriam stood over that map for a long time. It was the 5th crate that silenced everyone. It held documents of a different kind. Business records, correspondence, the kind of paper trail that told the story of a transaction or a series of transactions. Gerald Foss did not open these. He looked at the top sheet, a letter in a formal hand on heavy paper, and said, "This is outside my area. You need a historian or an archivist, and your attorney should look at this before anyone else does." Patricia's voice came over the phone. "Photograph everything in sequence before you touch it. Don't reorganize. Don't remove anything. Photograph it exactly as it is." Miriam photographed everything in sequence, working slowly and carefully with the phone's camera in the white light of the work lamps. Page by page, the contents of the 5th crate took shape. The correspondence was between parties she did not recognize, names that meant nothing to her immediately, but that Patricia, looking at the photographs that evening from her office 40 minutes away, recognized with the measured reaction of a woman who had been practicing property law for 25 years. The name that appeared most frequently in the correspondence belonged to a man who had, in the 1940s and early 1950s, been one of the most significant private landholders in the foothill region. A man whose family had sold off their holdings in pieces over the decades following his death. So a man whose estate had been in litigation for years over what had and hadn't been properly inventoried at the time of probate. Patricia called back that evening. Her voice had the quality of a person choosing words with extra care. "Miriam," she said, "what you have found is not just gold. What you have found is the missing piece of an estate that has been in legal dispute in this county for the better part of 60 years. Miriam sat on the step of the foreman's cabin and looked at the mill across the clearing in the dark. The creek ran to the north. The fir trees at the top of the hill were invisible against the night sky. "Is that good or bad?" she asked. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "It is complicated," she said, "but it is manageable. And the fact that it was on your land, transferred clean to your deed, before anyone knew what it contained, puts you in a position of considerable strength." Miriam thought about the silver car parked on the road. She thought about the acquisition firm and its incrementally increasing offers. She thought about Helen with her careful questions and her polite non-claims. "They know," Miriam said, "or they suspect. Someone knows the history of this property, and they know what might be in it." "Yes," Patricia said, "almost certainly. So what do we do?" "We move faster than they do," Patricia said, "and we stay cleaner than they do. We file the inventory. We establish the chain of documentation. We make sure that when this becomes public, and it will, we are already 3 steps ahead in the legal process." Miriam looked at the mill, the dark shape of it against the hillside, the intact western roof, the collapsed eastern end. "It's already worth something just as land," she said, almost to herself. "Yes," Patricia said, "but what's beneath it is worth considerably more." There was a pause between them, comfortable in the way of 2 women who have been through a serious conversation and have arrived at the part where the shape of the future is just becoming visible. "How much?" Miriam asked. "All of it. The gold, the coins, everything." Patricia gave her a range. It was a range that began in 8 figures and extended, with the coin collection properly assessed and the estate documentation properly leveraged, into 9. Miriam was quiet. "The creek ran in the trees to the north. I started with $6, she said. Patricia said, "I know." She sat on that step for a long time after the call ended. The night was cold and clear, and the stars over the foothill property were the kind of stars you only saw this far from the city, dense and indifferent and beautiful. She thought about every step, the envelope, the attorney's dry voice, the borrowed car, the cattle gate standing half open, the rusted hardware and the old feed table, and the smell of old wood and iron, the panel that did not want to move, the cold, dry air that rose from below, the flashlight beam touching the surface of something the color of afternoon sunlight. She thought about the people who had walked away. She thought about what it had cost her to stay. She heard the cabin door open behind her, and Cass's footsteps on the wooden step, the slight weight of her daughter settling beside her in the dark. "Can't sleep?" Miriam asked. "I heard you on the phone," Cass said. She was quiet for a moment. "Is it a lot?" Miriam looked at the stars. "Yes," she said. "It's a lot." Cass leaned against her mother's arm. The night was quiet except for the creek and the very faint movement of air through the fir trees above. "Are we going to be okay?" Cass asked. Miriam put her arm around her daughter and held her close and felt the specific weight of her, the living present warmth of her, and thought about the cots in the shelter and the $4 and the deed with both their names on it. "Yes," she said. "We're going to be okay." She said it the way you say something when it is no longer a hope, but a fact. The way you say something when the numbers on the page and the stone beneath the floor and the deed in your pocket have all agreed, after a very long time of everything agreeing against you, to agree in your favor. Cass sat with her for a while longer, and then went back inside. Miriam stayed on the step until the cold made staying unreasonable. Then she went inside too, and lay on the sleeping platform in the foreman's cabin, and listened to the creak, and for the first time in a very long time, did not count anything before she fell asleep. The call from the acquisition firm came the next morning before 8. The number they offered this time was different from the previous calls. It was not incrementally higher. It was a number with so many zeros that the representative recited it with a particular deliberateness, as though each zero was a separate argument for her compliance. She listened to the full number. Then she said, "I'm not interested in selling at this time." The representative's tone shifted, barely but perceptibly. He said that his clients understood she might need time to consider, but that the offer had a time limit, and that she should understand the complications that could arise from a property with the kind of historical complexity this one appeared to have. Miriam recognized the shape of what he was doing. It was what the ranger's supervisor had done with the East Route assignment, what the quiet men in the construction story had done with their non-disclosure agreements and their practiced calm. It was the application of institutional weight against a person they expected to feel small. She no longer felt small. She said, "Please direct any future communications to my attorney." She gave Patricia's number and ended the call. She stood in the clearing for a moment after. The mill was in front of her, its dark boards and its intact western roof, and the collapsed eastern end that somehow made the whole structure look both ruined and defiant. She had been thinking about the eastern section, about what it would take to stabilize it, to address the condemnation notice, to bring the structure up to a standard where it was no longer a liability on paper. She had begun to understand that this building, in addition to what lay beneath it, had a value of its own. The bones of it were good. Old-growth timber, the kind of material that was no longer available in the quantities needed to build something like this, still present and structurally sound in the sections where the roof had held. She thought about what it might become. She had not allowed herself to think that way before. Before, thinking about the future had felt dangerous, thought like spending money you did not have. But now the ground beneath her feet was hers, legally and completely, and beneath that ground was a stone chamber full of things that were already changing the shape of what was possible. And she let herself, for the first time, think about what came next. Not just survival, not just stability, but what came after that. The eastern end of the mill could be rebuilt. The roof could be restored. The electrical system could be brought up to code. 20 acres of foothill land, with a creek and a standing structure of this scale, was something that could be turned toward purpose. She did not know yet what that purpose was. She had not gotten that far. But she was beginning to understand that the question of what this place could become was a real question with real possible answers, and that she was in a position to be the one who decided. That was new. That was entirely new. She heard a car on the road and looked up to see Patricia Holst's vehicle turning in through the gate. Patricia parked in the clearing and got out with her leather notebook under her arm and the reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked at the mill and then at Miriam and said, "I filed the inventory this morning. We are on record." Miriam said, "The acquisition firm called." Patricia said, "I know. They called me too." She looked at the mill again. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Miriam looked at the mill. She had been looking at it every morning for 2 weeks now, and it looked different each time, not because it changed, but because she was changing, and the changed eye saw things differently. She saw the structure now not as a condemned ruin, but as what it actually was, a large, solid, well-built industrial building on 20 acres of productive land, with a stone-chambered vault beneath its floor containing a fortune that previous heirs had walked past without knowing, and an acquisition firm was now calling every morning, trying to acquire before the paperwork became unassailable. She looked at the mill, and she thought about the number Patricia had given her the night before, the range that started in 8 figures and extended into 9. She thought about the $6. "Yes," she said, "I'm ready." What came next arrived in layers, the way most consequential things did, not all at once, but in accumulating weight. The inventory filing had been the first public record, and public records were searchable, and the people who made careers out of searching them found it within 48 hours. The calls from the acquisition firm stopped. What replaced them was something more organized and considerably less polite, though it maintained the surface texture of politeness in the way that institutional pressure usually did. A law firm she had not heard of sent a letter to Patricia's office claiming to represent the estate of the original landowner, the man whose correspondence had appeared in the 5th crate. The letter asserted that the items discovered on the property were historically connected to that estate and requested an immediate halt to any appraisal or transfer activities pending the resolution of the estate's claim to the discovered assets. Patricia read the letter to Miriam over the phone in the measured voice of an attorney who was not surprised. "Can they do that?" Miriam asked. "They can send the letter," Patricia said. "Whether the claim has legal merit is a different question, and the answer to that question is almost certainly no, given the clean deed transfer and the documentation we have already filed. But they are going to try, and the attempt will take time to resolve." "How much time?" Patricia said. "That depends on how clean we are and how messy they are willing to get. So far, we are very clean." The woman named Helen called, not on the property phone, which Miriam had recently acquired in the form of a prepaid mobile she kept for property-related communications, but on her personal number, which meant Helen had done enough research to find it. The call was brief and polite, and concerned in the way of someone performing concern rather than feeling it. Helen said she had heard there were some legal complications arising from the property's history, and she wanted to make sure Miriam was all right. She said she had some documents that she believed might be relevant to the situation, and that she would be willing to share them privately if Miriam was open to a conversation. Miriam thanked her and said all communications should go through her attorney. She told Patricia about the call. Patricia said, "She has something she wants to trade. Either the documents are real and valuable, and she wants compensation for sharing them, or they are not what she claims, and she is trying to open a channel to introduce a competing narrative. Either way, the answer is the same. No private conversations. Everything through counsel." Miriam understood. She had begun to understand the shape of all of this, the way it was organized around the assumption that she could be maneuvered if approached from the right angle, if the pressure came from enough directions, if the offers and the claims and the concerned phone calls accumulated until the effort of holding her ground seemed greater than the relief of simply conceding something, giving something up, accepting a smaller version of what she had found. She had been a woman who counted $4.63 into her palm. She had slept on a donated cot in a shelter for 11 nights with her daughter beside her, and she had borrowed a car and driven to a condemned property on a gravel road and stood at a rusted gate that had been open for years because everyone else had walked past it. She was not going to be maneuvered now. The work continued in parallel with the legal maneuvering. Gerald Foss completed his full assessment of the coin collection, working through the rolled oilcloth packages with the careful patience of a man who understood that each piece deserved individual attention. The coins were extraordinary in their preservation, a fact he returned to repeatedly in his notes. The stone chamber, its consistent temperature, and near-zero humidity had provided conditions that most collectors would have designed specifically and still struggled to maintain. Coins that in typical storage would have shown the patina and wear of their age were, in many cases, as bright and detailed as the day they had been minted. He presented his full written assessment to Miriam and Patricia together on a Wednesday afternoon in Patricia's office, which was a room with high ceilings and afternoon light, and the particular smell of paper and effort that Miriam had come to associate with the serious conduct of serious business. The gold bars, Gerald said, assayed at an average of 23.2 carat across the full sample. The total weight of the gold inventory, 243 bars at standard ingot weight, represented a base metal value, at current market, of approximately $280 million. The number sat in the high-ceilinged room and was absorbed. The coin collection, he continued, was a separate matter. Pre-1933. American gold coins in the condition and variety represented in the crates were not simply worth their metal weight. They were numismatic items, collectibles, the kind of objects that serious collectors and institutions competed for at auction. His conservative estimate for the full collection, accounting for condition, rarity of specific dates, and mint marks, and current market activity, was between $18 and $25 million. He paused and looked at his notes. The survey maps and the correspondence from the fifth crate were outside his area, he said. But he had consulted with a colleague who worked in historical document appraisal and the preliminary assessment of those items, purely as historical artifacts, placed them in a range of several $100,000 at minimum, so potentially considerably more if the provenance could be established as cleanly as the documentation suggested. He closed his notebook. In total, he said, looking at Miriam with the expression of a man who had delivered remarkable news before, but found it did not become routine. The discovered assets represent a conservative appraised value of somewhere between $300 and $305 million, subject to final market conditions at the time of any transaction. The room was quiet. Patricia made a note. Miriam looked at her hands on the table. She had cleaned them carefully before coming to the meeting, but there was still a faint line of grime under one fingernail from the morning's work at the property. And she looked at that line and thought about the pry bar and the rope ladder and the cold, dry air coming up through the crack in the floor. $305 million from a property assessed at $6. She looked up at Gerald Foss. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of how level it was. The estate claim from the law firm was resolved more quickly than Patricia had expected, which Patricia said was a sign of weakness rather than strength, as opposing counsel tends to fold fast when they discover the ground is not as solid as they believed. The documentation that Miriam had found in the fifth crate, the correspondence, and the business records bearing the original landowner's name turned out to be something the estate's representatives had not anticipated. Rather than supporting their claim, it complicated it, establishing a chain of decisions made by the original landowner that suggested he had deliberately separated the stored items from his estate prior to his death, placing them outside the scope of the probate that had been in dispute for 60 years. Patricia explained this to Miriam with a contained satisfaction that was appropriate to the moment. "He hid it from his own heirs," Miriam said. "It appears that was his intention," Patricia said. "Whether for tax reasons or for other reasons we may never fully understand. But the effect of his actions was to create a situation where the items, stored on land that subsequently changed hands multiple times, eventually became attached to the land itself, rather than to any estate or trust. And the deed transferred clean." "The deed transferred clean," Patricia confirmed, "with full legal title to everything on or in the property." Miriam thought about that for a moment. A man had hidden something enormous from everyone who might have claimed it, had sealed it beneath a concrete panel in a stone chamber beneath a working mill, had drawn a map of it on heavy paper, and stored the map with the thing the map described. and had walked away. And then the mill had closed, and the property had changed hands, and the years had passed, and the condemnation notice had been filed, and every heir in the chain had looked at the $6 assessment and decided it was not worth the trouble. And then an envelope had arrived at a shelter mail desk with her name typed on the front. She thought about what it meant that things happened the way they happened. She had never been a person who believed in fate or design or any of the comfortable architectures people built to explain why some things worked out and some things did not. She believed in decisions. She believed in the accumulation of small choices that added up over time into something that looked, from a distance, like a pattern. The decision to accept the transfer. The decision to go into the mill instead of standing outside it. The decision to kneel at the crack in the floor instead of walking past it. The decision to borrow the car and drive up into the hills instead of surrendering to the numbers on the paper in front of her. Each one small, each one possible to decline. Each one a door that stood slightly open and required only the willingness to go through it. She had gone through them all. The legal clearance when it came. They arrived in the form of a letter from the county recorder, confirming the inventory filing and acknowledging the clean title. Patricia filed it with a quiet efficiency that Miriam had come to appreciate as one of the attorney's great gifts. No drama. No announcement. Just the steady building of an unassailable record. The acquisition firm sent one more letter. It was the most explicit communication she had received from them, stripped of the practiced pleasantness of the earlier calls. It laid out their position directly, which was that they had clients with historical connection to the region who believed that the discovery on her property raised legitimate questions about ownership, and that they were prepared to pursue those questions through available legal channels if she was unwilling to reach an accommodation. Miriam read the letter twice. Then she handed it to Patricia and said, "Does this worry you?" Patricia read it with the same careful attention she gave everything. Then she put it down and looked at Miriam over the reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. "No," she said. "It worries them. That's why they sent it." The thing about pressure, Miriam had learned in recent weeks, was that it felt very different depending on which direction you were coming from. Applied to someone who had something to lose and no ground to stand on, pressure was devastating. Applied to someone who had built their ground carefully, one documented step at a time, who had filed their inventory and established their chain of title and engaged qualified counsel before a single photograph had appeared anywhere. Pressure was just noise. Unpleasant noise, and sometimes frightening noise, but noise that the solid documentation behind her could absorb without yielding. She was not the person who had been in that shelter. She was the same woman. Yes, the same woman who had counted pennies and slept on a cot and driven a borrowed car up a gravel road into the hills. But she was that woman with a deed and an assay report and an attorney and a stone chamber full of gold under a mill that no one had thought was worth anything. The noise was just noise. She went back to the property every morning. She continued to work. She had begun engaging a structural engineer to assess the eastern section's collapse and what remediation would require. She had begun researching the process for lifting the condemnation notice, which was not as complicated as she had feared once the structural issues were addressed. She had spoken to the school district about enrolling Cass for the full year, and Cass had come home one afternoon with a drawing she had made in art class, a picture of a building with a creek beside it and two figures standing in front of it, one tall and one small, both of them clearly at home. Miriam had put the drawing on the wall of the foreman's cabin with a piece of tape. It was still there on the morning that the news broke. She had known it would break eventually. Patricia had told her it would. The inventory filing was a public record, and journalists ran those searches routinely. Someone had put the pieces together. The deed transfer, the assay registration, the legal correspondence that was now part of the county's publicly accessible files, and had written a story. She did not see the story until Patricia called her at 7:30 in the morning to tell her it was out. It had run in a regional business publication first, a careful piece that focused on the legal and financial dimensions without too much color. But within hours it had been picked up by larger outlets, each iteration adding detail and losing precision in the way of these things, the numbers growing slightly in some versions, and the circumstances becoming slightly more dramatic in others, but the core of it remaining consistent. A woman had inherited a condemned sawmill on a gravel road in the foothills. She had accepted it for $6 when no one else would. She had gone inside when everyone else had walked away. And beneath the floor of that condemned mill, in a stone chamber sealed for decades, and she had found a fortune that the county had assessed at nothing, and the market had appraised at $305 million. Her phone began ringing before 8. She let most of it go to voicemail. She answered Patricia's calls and Deb's call, which was short and warm, and consisted almost entirely of Deb saying, "I knew it. I knew it," in a voice that was thick with something between triumph and tears. She took Cass to school that morning as usual. Cass had heard enough the previous night to understand that things were changing, that the quiet weeks of work on the property were giving way to something louder and more public. She had accepted this with the equanimity she brought to most things. In the car on the way to school, she asked, "Are people going to come to the property?" "Probably," Miriam said. "Are we going to let them?" "Not yet," Miriam said. "Not until things are settled." Cass looked out the window at the foothill road, the oaks and the dry grass, and the occasional glimpse of the valley below. "They should have gone in," she said. Miriam glanced at her. "Who?" "The other people," Cass said. "The ones who didn't take it." Miriam looked at the road ahead. "Yes," she said. "They should have. But they didn't," Cass said. "And you did." Miriam thought about the gate standing half open, the concrete panel that had not moved in decades, the dry, cold air rising from the dark, the flashlight beam touching something the color of afternoon sunlight. "Yes," she said. "I did." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that did not need filling. The valley opened below them as they descended toward the school, wide and morning gold. And Miriam thought about all the things that were about to change, and all the things that would not, and she felt the solid weight of both, and did not flinch from either. She dropped Cass at the school gate. Cass got out with her backpack, and then turned back and looked at her mother through the car window with those steady, paying attention eyes. "We're going to be okay," she said. She said it back to her mother. A gift. The thing returned. Miriam smiled. "Go to school," she said. She drove back up into the hills, back to the property, back to the mill with its dark boards and its intact western roof and the wide, cleared space above the stone chamber where the world had been sealed away for 60 years and was now, carefully and irrevocably, coming back into the light. The morning after the news broke, she stood at the edge of the property and watched a car slow on the road outside the gate and stop. A man got out with a camera and looked through the fence at the mill. She watched him for a moment, this stranger trying to see from a distance the thing she had earned by going close. He took a few photographs and drove away. Within an hour, 2 more vehicles had done the same thing. By afternoon, there were 4. She called Patricia. Patricia said, "This is manageable. We do not grant access. We do not comment publicly yet. We let the coverage run its course. In 2 weeks, it will be a different story someone else is in." She watched the cars come and go from the cabin window and thought about what it meant to be looked at. She had spent most of the previous months being the person no one was looking at. The woman in the shelter, For the woman at the convenience store counter, the woman with the borrowed car, and the deed no one else wanted. Invisible in the specific way that people without resources became invisible, not because they were small, but because the world had stopped expecting anything interesting from them. She had moved through that invisibility for months. Now a man had driven from somewhere to take photographs of her gate. She understood that the story the world was telling about her was not entirely her story. The world's version was simpler than the truth. The world's version had a before and an after, and a number that connected them. And the number was large enough to make the story feel satisfying in the way that round numbers and sudden reversals satisfied. The truth was more complicated. And the truth had 11 nights on a cot, and $340, and a concrete panel that did not want to move, and an appraiser with a notebook, and an attorney with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a child holding a lantern steady. The truth did not fit into a headline, but it was what had actually happened, and she held it carefully because it was hers. The story moved through the world the way stories did when the facts were extraordinary enough to carry themselves without embellishment. Within 48 hours, it had passed beyond the regional publications and into national coverage. The numbers were what drove it. $305 million was a number that people stopped and read. The circumstances were what made them stay. A woman alone, a child, a condemned building, a $6 deed, a concrete panel in a floor that no one had lifted for decades. These were the elements of a story that people recognized in some deep way, not because it had happened to them, but because it touched something they understood about doors that looked closed and fortunes that waited on the other side of persistence. The coverage was not uniformly accurate. Some versions got the numbers slightly wrong. Some described Miriam in language that was more dramatic than she would have chosen for herself, language that emphasized her circumstances in ways that felt reductive, that turned her into a symbol before she had finished being a person navigating a complicated situation. She did not correct the coverage publicly. Patricia advised against it. There was nothing to gain from engaging with imprecision when the legal record spoke clearly for itself. What she could not control was who the coverage reached. The woman from the shelter called. The director, a steady woman named Gloria, who had managed the facility for 11 years and had seen people at their most desperate and their most resilient, and had learned not to be surprised by either. She called to tell Miriam that the staff had seen the story and that they were proud of her, and that if there was anything the shelter could do to support her through the transition, they were there. She did not ask for anything. That, after the weeks of acquisition calls and competing claims and careful voiced pressure, it was such an unusual thing that Miriam sat with the phone held against her cheek for a moment after the call ended and felt something release in her chest that she had not known was held. She called Gloria back that afternoon. She said she wanted to make a donation. Gloria said that was generous and asked what amount she had in mind. Miriam named a figure. It was large enough that Gloria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Miriam, that is more than our operating budget for 3 years." Miriam said, "I know." Another silence. Then Gloria said, with the particular steadiness of a woman who managed not to let her voice break when things broke her heart in the good direction, "We will put it to work." That was the first. It was not the last. She had thought in the week since the assay about what the money meant. Not in the abstract way that people imagined thinking about money as a fantasy of things purchased or experiences accumulated, but in the specific practical way of a woman who had spent months managing shortfalls and understanding precisely what the difference between enough and not enough felt like from the inside. She understood what it meant not to have it. She understood what the specific weights were that it lifted when it arrived. The shelter had been one weight, The first thing she did after the donation to Gloria was address the emergency assistance loan from the shelter's fund, the $340 that had covered the back taxes on the property. She repaid it with interest she had calculated herself, more than the fund would have charged, because the fund existed for people who needed it, and the money it held was not limitless, and it had given her the lift she needed when she had nothing else. $340 had bought her a deed. The deed had led to everything. She wanted that $340 back in circulation for whoever came next, and needed it the way she had needed it. The social worker who had warned her about environmental liabilities called with an apology that was genuine and slightly embarrassed, the apology of a person who had been doing their job correctly by advising caution and was now confronting the fact that caution had not been the right counsel for the specific situation. Miriam accepted the apology without ceremony. The social worker had not been wrong to worry. She had been working with incomplete information, the way most people worked, and had advised accordingly. There was nothing to forgive. The woman from her old neighborhood, the one who had said she admired Miriam's spirit, sent a message through a mutual acquaintance. It was warm and congratulatory, and contained, somewhere in its middle section, the suggestion that if Miriam was ever looking for investment advice or partnerships, her husband knew people in the finance industry who would be delighted to help. Miriam did not respond, not from bitterness, from the simple understanding that the relationships that had sustained her through the hard months were the ones that mattered, and those were the ones she had already tended to. The woman at the shelter who had lent her the 15-year-old sedan called, flustered and laughing at herself in equal measure, and she said she had seen the news, and was she in trouble for driving the car? Did Miriam need anything? Was everything all right? Miriam told her everything was all right. She told her the car had been essential. She told her that without the car, she could not have driven to the property the first time, and without that first visit, none of the rest of it would have happened. The woman laughed in the disbelieving way of someone who has accidentally done something consequential. Miriam thanked her properly, which was a thing she had not been in a position to do before. She bought her a new car, not an extravagant one, a practical one, with good tires and a dashboard that wasn't cracked, that would run reliably for a long time and take her where she needed to go. She arranged it without announcement, so instructing the dealership to call the woman and tell her only that someone had purchased it for her and that the paperwork was in her name and the keys were ready whenever she wanted them. She heard later, through Deb, that the woman had cried at the dealership. Miriam thought about that and felt something in her chest that was too specific and too full to have a simple name. Patricia's office managed the formal process of transferring the discovered assets through the legal and tax channels that the inventory filing had established. The IRS assessment arrived and was substantial, as Patricia had warned it would be, and Miriam paid it without complaint. She had always paid what she owed. The amount was different now, but the principle was the same. You did not pretend the numbers were different than they were. You looked at them, you accounted for them, and you moved forward. What remained after taxes was still a number with more zeros than she had ever seen attached to her name. She sat with Patricia in the high-ceilinged office on a Tuesday afternoon in December, the light coming through the tall windows at the low angle of winter, and they went through the final accounting together. Patricia was precise and thorough, and occasionally allowed herself a small smile when a particular line item resolved in a satisfying way. Miriam followed every number, as she always had, because her father's training was still with her, and always would be. You looked at the numbers. You did not look away. When they reached the final figure, Patricia set her pen down and looked at Miriam over the reading glasses. You are, as of this moment, legally and financially secure in a way that your daughter and her children will also be legally and financially secure, she said. What you choose to do with that security is entirely your own. Miriam looked at the number on the page. It was very large. It had come from the earth of a property that the county had assessed at $6, that every previous heir had refused, that the acquisition firm had tried to buy for a number they thought was generous, and she had known was small. It had come from a stone chamber beneath a condemned mill on 20 acres of foothill land that she had driven to in a borrowed car because she had no other options that were not surrender. She thought about surrender, about what it would have looked like to choose it. The shelter's 30-day limit would have passed. She would have moved on to the next temporary solution, and the next, carrying Cass through the sequence of inadequate arrangements that poverty organized itself into when it had a person firmly in its logic. The property on Sutter Creek Road would have reverted to the county and been placed in the tax sale inventory and sold eventually to someone, perhaps to the acquisition firm that had been calling her, perhaps to someone else entirely. And whatever came next, whether it was the condemnation proceeding that would have eventually authorized the demolition of the mill, or a new owner who went inside and lifted the panel, or some other sequence of events entirely, it would not have been hers. She had not chosen surrender. That was the whole story, reduced to its smallest true element. She had not chosen surrender when it would have been the easiest thing in the world to choose. She had taken an envelope from a mail desk and called an attorney with a dry voice and borrowed a car and driven up a gravel road and stood in front of a gate standing half open and gone through it. Everything else had followed from that. The mill was no longer condemned. The structural engineer had completed his assessment in November, and the repair plan had been submitted to the county. The eastern section, where the roof had collapsed, was more salvageable than anyone had expected. The primary timbers had held. What had failed was the secondary roofing system, the purlins, and the corrugated metal, not the bones of the building. A competent restoration contractor could address it. Several had already submitted bids. She had chosen among them with the same care she had given every decision since arriving at the property, looking for quality rather than speed, for people who understood that old industrial structures deserved the particular kind of attention that came from understanding what they had been. The condemnation notice was lifted in December. Patricia had processed the paperwork as cleanly as everything else she touched. The county recorder's office sent the formal notice of clearance in an envelope that Miriam opened at the table in the foreman's cabin on a morning when the first frost of the season had laid a thin white film over the clearing and the creek was running high with the early winter rain. She held the letter and looked out the window at the mill. The mill was hers, legally, completely, and finally without qualification. Not a liability with her name on it. Not a condemned structure she was responsible for insuring at a cost she could not afford. Her property, her building, her 20 acres of foothill land, with the seasonal creek and the stand of second-growth fir and the stone chamber beneath the floor that had given up its secret to the person patient enough to lift the lid. She put the letter on the table beside Cass's drawing, the one with the building and the creek, and the two figures clearly at home. The drawing was still held with a piece of tape. She left it that way. What she built in the months that followed was not built quickly or carelessly. Miriam had spent enough time around construction in her years working for the small company whose offices she had managed, so to understand that the buildings worth inhabiting were the ones whose foundations were not rushed. The mill restoration began in January with a crew that had been carefully selected, people who showed up when they said they would and did the work they described and did not cut corners because no one was watching. She was watching. She was there every morning, as she had been since October, walking the property in the cold early light with her coffee and her notebook. The eastern section came back slowly, which was the right way for it to come back. Timber by timber, the repair worked its way along the collapsed roof system, salvaging what could be salvaged and replacing what could not, with material that matched in species and dimension, and was sourced from a mill operation she had researched and visited before committing to. The boards were true, the joints were tight. The work was done with the care of people who had been told and had believed that this building mattered. The stone chamber was sealed again, not with concrete, not with the permanent disguise that had hidden it for 60 years, but properly, with a hinged access panel set into a reinforced floor section, accessible and documented, and no longer a secret from anything. Gerald Foss had suggested, with the dry humor of a man whose professional life had prepared him for many situations, but perhaps not quite this one, that it might serve as the most unusual wine cellar in the foothill region. It would not be a wine cellar. Miriam had a different idea for it, one that had been forming since the morning she had first stood at the edge of the opening and looked down into the dark. And she did not share it widely. She let it develop in private, the way good ideas needed to develop before they were ready to meet the world. Cass turned 8 in February. Her birthday party was held at the property for the first time, a small gathering of the friends she had made at the district school, children who arrived with their parents and stood in the clearing and looked at the mill with the wide-eyed assessment of children encountering something large and old and not entirely explained. The western section had been cleared and swept and lit with strings of warm bulbs that Miriam had hung from the rafters. There was a long table with a paper tablecloth and a cake, and the particular joy of children who have been given a space that feels like an adventure. Cass stood in the center of the mill floor in the warm light and looked at her friends, and then at her mother, and then at the building around her, and her expression was the expression of a child who has arrived at something she had not known she was heading toward, but recognizes completely upon arrival. She did not say anything. She just smiled, which was more than enough. Ray came to the party. He stood near the entrance with a cup of coffee and watched the children with the benign attention of a man who had seen many things and had learned to appreciate the uncomplicated ones. Deb came too, driving 3 hours from the city, because she had said she would be there when things settled, and this was the most settled they had been. She stood beside Miriam in the mill and looked at the rafters and the warm light and the running children, and said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose instincts had been confirmed, "I always knew this building had good bones." Miriam looked at her. "Yes," she said, "it does." Gloria from the shelter came in March. Miriam had invited her specifically, wanting her to see the property before the idea she had been developing was ready, wanting her to understand the context in which it had formed. They walked the 20 acres together in the early spring light, when the grass was coming back green and the creek was full, and the fir trees at the top of the property held the particular deep color of things that had been growing undisturbed for a long time. Gloria was not a woman who said much that was not necessary, which was a quality Miriam had always appreciated in people. She walked, and she observed, and she asked a few questions, and she let the property speak for itself. At the end of the walk, they stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the mill, which was further along in its restoration now, its eastern section rising again under its new roof, its western section clean and lit and structurally sound. Miriam told her the idea. All of it, the full shape of it as it had formed over the winter. The stone chamber would not be sealed away again. It would be incorporated into the building's story, made accessible, documented, and presented as what it was, the place where a fortune had waited through 6 decades of silence for someone willing to go looking for it. But that was not the central purpose of what she was planning. The mill, on all 4,000 square feet of the western section and the restored eastern section, would become a working space, not a museum, not a monument to what had been found, a working space, the kind that the building had always been, dedicated to work. specifically to the work of people who were in the position Miriam had been in when she had arrived at this property. People who had skills and ideas and the capacity to build something, but who were working without the resources that made building possible. A workshop, a maker's space, a place for people who were at the edge of something and needed a room and a table and the time to figure out what came next. With a residency program and a tool library and a commercial kitchen for the food entrepreneurs who never had access to licensed equipment and a childcare room because she understood, from direct experience, that the reason people with children could not do certain things was usually not lack of will, but lack of someone to watch the child while the will was being exercised. Gloria listened to all of it without interrupting. When Miriam finished, she looked at the mill for a long moment. Then she said, "You were in that shelter for 11 nights." "Yes," Miriam said, "and you spent the time between then and now building this." "Most of it, yes." Gloria was quiet. The creek ran in the trees to the north. The spring light was soft and without edge, the kind of light that made the foothills look like they had been painted with patience. "I want to be involved," Gloria said. "If you'll have me." Miriam said she would. The formal opening of the Sutter Creek Workshop, as it came to be known, was held on a Saturday in May, when the oaks were fully leafed and the grass was still green and the property looked its best in the generous light of late spring. People came from the surrounding towns and from the county seat and from farther away, drawn by the story that had been in the news and curious to see what the place had become. They walked the grounds and went through the mill and stood at the edge of the open access panel in the floor and looked down into the stone chamber, which was lit now with carefully placed lights that showed the alcove and the shelves and the natural bedrock walls without diminishing the particular quality of the space. Its deep, cool patience, the feeling of something that had held its secret for a very long time and had given it up to the right person at the right moment. Where children pressed against the railing around the opening and peered down with the pure hunger for the extraordinary that children brought to things that adults had learned to temper with caution. Miriam watched them and thought about Cass with the lantern, holding it steady while her mother worked the pry bar, asking practical questions, being exactly the kind of person she had always been. The first cohort of residents arrived in June. 8 people, selected from a pool of applicants that had grown larger than Miriam had expected once the word had spread through the county's networks of small business development offices and community organizations and the particular informal channels through which people in need of resources found out about places that offered them. 8 people with plans and skills and the specific kind of determination that came from having tried to move forward without the right tools and not having stopped trying. A woman who repaired vintage electronics and needed a workspace with proper ventilation. A man who had been developing a line of handmade furniture for 3 years in a garage so small he could not stand 2 pieces side by side to compare them. A woman who made medicinal herbal preparations and needed a licensed commercial kitchen to bring her products to market legally. A young man barely out of his teens who had been writing code for agricultural automation systems on a second-hand laptop in his mother's kitchen and had run out of computing resources 2 months before completing something that a regional farming cooperative was already interested in. Each of them arrived with the particular energy of someone who has been told yes for the first time after a long sequence of no's. Miriam recognized it the way she recognized the mill in the early morning light, with the certainty of something personally known. She walked each of them through the space on their first morning, the way she had walked it herself in October, letting the building explain its own layout and purpose. She showed them the access panel in the floor and told them briefly what had been beneath it, because it was part of the story of the building, and the story of the building was part of why they were standing in it. They looked at the brass plate with its dimensions and its date. They looked at each other. Several of them said nothing. The woman who repaired electronics reached down and touched the edge of the panel with one finger. The way people touched things they found difficult to believe. Miriam understood the impulse. She had felt it herself, standing at the edge of the opening with the flashlight beam pointing into the dark. The impulse to make contact with the physical fact of an improbable thing. Several people said some version of the same thing as they moved through the mill. They said it in different words, but the shape of it was consistent. They said, "I can't believe someone else didn't find this sooner." Miriam heard that and thought about it carefully, because it was a statement that contained an assumption she was not sure was correct. The assumption was that discovery was inevitable, that if Miriam had not gone into the mill, someone else eventually would have, that the fortune in the stone chamber was simply waiting for the next person to come along. She was not sure that was true. The previous heirs had not gone in. They had looked at the $6 assessment and the condemnation notice and the $340 in back taxes, and they had made a rational calculation and walked away. It was the correct calculation if you were working from the information available on the surface. The surface information said this was a worthless liability. Nothing on the surface said otherwise. What had made the difference was not that Miriam had better information. She had the same information everyone else had. What had made the difference was that she had no other options. She was a woman with a 7-year-old daughter and 2 canvas bags in a shelter with a 30-day limit and a borrowed car and the stubborn incapacity for surrender. She had not gone through the gate because she knew what was on the other side. She had gone through it because the alternative was standing still, and standing still, in her situation, was its own kind of slow disaster. She thought about that sometimes, about how the circumstances that had made her life so desperate were also the circumstances that had made the discovery possible. If she had had other options, she would have taken them. If she had had a house to return to, or a steady income, or a family nearby to help, she would not have driven up that gravel road with a borrowed car and a deed worth $6. She would have left the property to the county and moved on. The poverty had given her no choice but to look more carefully, and looking more carefully had given her everything. She was not sure that was true. The previous heirs had not gone in. They had looked at the $6 assessment and the condemnation notice and the $340 in back taxes, and they had made a rational calculation and walked away. It was the correct calculation if you were working from the information available on the surface. The surface information said this was a worthless liability. Nothing on the surface said otherwise. What had made the difference was not that Miriam had better information. She had the same information everyone else had. What had made the difference was that she had no other options, and she was a woman with a 7-year-old daughter and 2 canvas bags in a shelter with a 30-day limit and a borrowed car and the stubborn incapacity for surrender. She had not gone through the gate because she knew what was on the other side. She had gone through it because the alternative was standing still, and standing still, in her situation, was its own kind of slow disaster. She thought about that sometimes, about how the circumstances that had made her life so desperate were also the circumstances that had made the discovery possible. If she had had other options, she would have taken them. If she had had a house to return to, or a steady income, or a family nearby to help, she would not have driven up that gravel road with a borrowed car and a deed worth $6. She would have left the property to the county and moved on. Poverty had given her no choice but to look more carefully. And looking more carefully had given her everything. She did not sentimentalize that. She did not pretend that poverty was a gift, or that hardship was a secret advantage waiting to be revealed. She had lived the hardship without the revelation for long enough to know that the hardship was real, and that most of the time it did not lead to stone chambers full of gold. Most of the time, it led to more hardship, and the people who endured it deserved support and resources, and the kind of community infrastructure that did not run on 30-day limits. That understanding was not abstract. She carried it in her body, in the specific memory of what it felt like to count $4.63 into her palm, and know that it was what remained. She did not want that feeling to become a story she told about the past. She wanted it to remain a fact she lived with in the present, close enough to inform the decisions she made now about how to use what she had. The people in the workshop, the 8 residents and the ones who would come after them, were living versions of the person she had been in October. They had skills and will and the particular durability of people who had kept working when the working had not yet produced results. She had no illusion that she could guarantee them what she had found. The stone chamber had been an accident of circumstance and history, and the specific stubbornness of one woman on one October morning. She could not replicate that. What she could replicate was the room, the table, the tool, the licensed kitchen, the child care room, the time. Those things were within her power to provide, and she provided them without strings, because that was how it had worked for her. The shelter had given her the loan without strings. The loan had bought the deed. The deed had led to everything. She believed in the unencumbered gift, in the resource extended without the requirement that it be justified in advance. People did their best work when they were trusted rather than audited, and she had enough money now to trust people the way she herself had needed to be trusted, not as a symbol, but as a structure, a practical, funded, operational place where the next person who had skills and ideas and no room to work them out could come and find what they needed. She could not fix the larger situation. She could build one building on one 20-acre property and make it available. That was what she could do, and she did it completely, without hedging. The day after the opening, she drove Cass to school, as she always did. Down the hill from the property on the road that had become so familiar, she navigated it without thinking, through the oak woodland and the dry grass, and the places where the valley came into view below. Cass sat in the passenger seat with her school bag in her lap, and looked out the window and thought her own thoughts, which she shared when she was ready and kept private when she wasn't. Miriam had always respected that. She was the same way herself. At the bottom of the hill, where the road met the county road, Cass said, "Mom, are you happy?" Miriam considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not the automatic reassurance that adults sometimes gave children when they asked questions that required real answers, but the genuine consideration of the question as asked. She thought about the shelter, and the cots, and the borrowed car, and the gate standing half open. She thought about the cold, dry air rising from the crack in the floor, and the flashlight beam touching gold. She thought about the acquisition firm's calls, and Patricia's measured voice, building the record one step at a time. She thought about Gloria and Deb and Ray, and the woman whose new car was sitting in a driveway, somewhere being driven to places she needed to go. She thought about Cass's drawing still on the cabin wall, held with a piece of tape, and the birthday party in the mill with the strings of warm lights and the running children. She thought about the workshop and the people who would come to it, and the things they would make there, and the lives they would build in the rooms of it. She thought about what the mill looked like in the early morning light before anyone arrived, when the clearing was still and the creek was audible to the north, and the fir trees at the top of the property held their deep, patient green, and the building stood in its restored solidity against the hillside, both old and new at once, both what it had been and what it was becoming. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." Cass nodded, as if this were the correct answer to a question she had already worked out the answer to herself. Then she looked back out the window and let the road go past, and did not say anything else for a while. They drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other well enough not to need to fill the space between them. the valley spreading out below, the morning opening up ahead, the world, which had been so narrow for so long now, wide in every direction. She dropped Cass at the school gate and watched her walk in, and did not leave until she had disappeared through the door, the way she always did, the way she had done every morning since they had arrived at the property in October with 2 canvas bags and a deed worth $6. Then she turned the car around and drove back up into the hills, back to the 20 acres and the creek and the fir trees and the mill with its restored roof and its warm western section and the stone chamber beneath the floor where 60 years of darkness had given way to something that was still not finished, becoming what it was. She parked in the clearing and got out and stood in the spring morning air. The oaks were fully green. The grass had come up thick along the edges of the cleared ground. The creek was talking in the trees to the north, full and purposeful, going where it had always been going, indifferent to everything and quietly essential. She stood in front of the mill for a moment, the mill that everyone else had walked away from, the mill that the county had assessed at $6 and the acquisition firm had wanted to buy, and the law firm had tried to claim, and the world had said was worthless. The mill that had been none of those things. She thought about the first morning she had stood here, the borrowed car and the rusted gate and the smell of old wood and iron that had arrived before the building was visible, the way the land had opened into the clearing and the mill had revealed itself in pieces. Roof first, then walls, then the specific darkness of its empty windows. The moment she had understood that it was larger than she had imagined, and older, and more deliberate, and more solidly built than $6 should have implied. She had known something then. Not what she would find. Not the stone chamber, or the wrapped forms, or the number in Gerald Foss's pencil. She had known something simpler and more foundational than that. She had known that this place deserved attention, that it deserved someone willing to go inside rather than stand at the edge and make a calculation, that whatever it contained, whether it was nothing or something, it deserved the respect of being actually looked at. She had looked. The rest had followed. She walked to the mill entrance and slid the door along its track, the sound of it familiar now, the resistance of the rusted metal understood and accounted for. The interior opened before her, the morning light coming through the western windows and the new skylights she had added in the restoration, falling clean and even across the concrete floor and the old feed table and the rafters and the hardware that was still original and still exactly where it had been when a generation of workers had installed it, and a generation of workers had used it, and then one day the operation had stopped, and the building had gone quiet and waited. She walked the length of the floor as she did every morning. She checked the spaces she was responsible for, and thought about the day ahead, and the work that needed doing, and the people who would come to the workshop, and what they would make there. She walked past the access panel in the floor, solid and hinged, and flush with the concrete, its surface marked with a small brass plate she had installed that gave the depth of the chamber below and the date of its discovery, and nothing else. She stopped at the panel and looked at it for a moment. Then she kept walking. The work was in front of her, and the morning was generous, and the property that had cost her $6 and everything she had was fully, irreversibly, finally hers. She walked toward the light. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.